January 6th probe has two key deadlines coming up. One we know, one is secret. First, 4 Trump aides who were hit with subpoenas have a deadline of this Thursday to comply. That includes Bannon and the former chief of staff. Lawmakers are saying that if those don't comply, then the committee will use this criminal referral process to get the DOJ to open a probe, which could lead to potentially indictment.
In terms of depositions, I know that some of them are coming close for Meadows and others. Do you think that they're going to show up? Have you heard from those legal teams?
Well, the only thing I can say is the committee will probably, to those who don't agree to come in voluntarily, will do criminal referrals and let that process work out.
That is tough talk. He is using the legal language for something that can put people in jail. Then there's a big deadline. Politico reports that the deadline for Trump to ask Biden to shield his records is expected to arrive midweek. The exact timing, though, shrouded in secrecy. I'm joined by former federal prosecutor Barbara McQuade. First, walk us through what criminal referral means there.
Well, this is something that was missing in the last administration when we saw Congress issuing subpoenas to Trump administration officials, and they simply dragged their feet and thumbed their nose. That means that they can refer to the Justice Department a request to find them in contempt. So the Justice Department would actually file charges to ask a judge to hold them in criminal contempt. It was a non-starter when Bill Barr was the Attorney General, but I think in the Justice Department of Merrick Garland, this is absolutely an option that should be on the table.
And the executive privilege clash we've covered extensively. Now it's up to Trump to actually do something he probably doesn't even emotionally want to do based on his public statements, which is ask for the person who has power, President Biden, to use that privilege on his behalf. Where do you see that going?
Yeah, I think this is where we're going to see some real activity, because one of the things that we could see is a positive assertion of executive privilege here. It is for the current president to decide whether to assert executive privilege. And of course, there's a reason for it. It may get in the way of sharing information and providing transparency, but it promotes candor in decision making among administration officials. And so it is up to the current president to decide whether to assert it. But that doesn't mean that a former president doesn't have some interest in it. Former presidents can ask a current president to assert privilege over certain matters that occurred during a prior administration. But ultimately, this will be Joe Biden's call. So I think that's a very important thing. The one thing that we could see that could be very interesting in all of this is civil lawsuits filed by these witnesses, like a Mark Meadows or someone else, saying that it's Donald Trump who wants to assert the privilege, and yet the Biden administration is refusing to do so. Somebody needs to protect this privilege. I think that could be a very interesting legal case. The negative consequence of that, of course, is to drag these things out and delay them. And we've seen so often the Trump administration play this strategy of just stalling, and running out the clock.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of signals they want to do that again. The other thing is something we've told viewers will stay on: accountability in the many cases regarding the insurrection. Here's a headline that's interesting of a judge who basically was saying there have to be consequences, and saying attempted violent overthrow of the government requires serious sanction, the judge going farther than the DOJ and dealing with one of the defendant protesters. I'm curious what you thought of that.
Yeah, I think this is something we could see again. You know, when you're at the Justice Department, you have to think about managing not only this case, but the 600 or so cases that they're managing. I think there's probably some effort to take consistent positions throughout those cases, and also just some simple docket management. If every one of those cases goes to trial, they won't be able to do it. And so finding ways to give people incentives to plead guilty, and maybe even going a little light. You know, Ari, if you've ever been pulled over for speeding, not that I'm sure you ever do, but you may have found that an officer might write the ticket for, even though you're going 10 under, they'll write the ticket for 5 under. And that is in a hope that you'll plead guilty and say, all right, you got me. I was going 5 under. Because if everybody who is going 10 over contests their ticket and goes to trial, the system falls apart. So I think sometimes judges do have an important role to play there in pushing back, because prosecutors have a number of factors to think about. And it's usually up to the judge to decide what the sentence ought to be.
Yeah, you make an important point that goes to how this works. Some of the first cases we're hearing about, by definition, are the ones that reached an agreement. They may not be representative of the holdouts of the next 300. And yet I've seen some really strong criticism that they look lenient. So it's an interesting thing to think through. Barbara McQuade, thank you as always.
you.